So we're going to transition again out of selection processes into the arrangement. So we're going to be looking at how we place different features, different objects on the map surface, how they interact with each other, how we can change the perception of the map user and the audience by subtle little tweaks to the positioning and arrangement of things on the map. The first of these is a visual hierarchy, one of the more important ones. And visual hierarchy refers to the order in which a reader perceives different objects in a graphic visual design. And a good map should establish very clearly what's important and what's not important. So, what's important should essentially pop out against a background. So that's something we'll call later on the figure-ground relationship. But you should have a very clear visual hierarchy between what's important on a map, and then the objects or features of lesser importance should be pushed further and further into the background, depending on how non-important they are to the main message. Okay, so let's take a look at an example of that. So this is an example drawn from the exercises in the book. It's a map product that you will be producing in the text. And we're seeing here on the left is the main map, on the right the key or the legend and ancillary information about the map. And so to my eye, what pops out is we see the mountains, in this case volcanoes, Mount Baker, Glacier Peak, Rainier, St. Helens, etc. That symbol pops out first. The text symbols for those, the annotations, are highlighted slightly to pop out against the background. Those catch my eye first. Secondary, we've got the capital cities as stars in both of these states, Washington and Oregon. In the background, I'm starting to see some color patterning. Looking over at the key, I see that's people per square mile. And then behind that, I'm seeing indications of counties. And then something about terrain. Okay, so that's a visual hierarchy. What catches your eye first? Where does it go next? And you're getting you're seeing like the surface of a pool. And if you're wearing a mask or goggles, you get down in the pool and you get lower and lower and lower. You see more and more detail underneath the surface. But whatever's floating on top, that's your visual hierarchy. That's the top of the hierarchy. And then down lower and lower levels, we see the interplay here of the symbols and the color choices. They subdue the things that aren't as important to the theme of the map, or maybe they're important, but the really critical things are the ones that pop out. They literally should pop out, even though it's in two dimensions, from that surface and grab your attention. Okay, so this is what visual hierarchy is all about. Establishing that. What's really important you should be seeing first, and then items of slightly lesser importance underneath that, and then background information that may not even be necessary, but it's nice to have, such as that idea of terrain underneath as a background, that hill shaded kind of view of the landscape, and then the water depths off to the left hand side. Those are details that add to the map. But if they weren't there, we would still have a map showing us volcano locations with county-based population information, within two different adjacent states. That stuff could still work. The background just makes it nicer. It gives it a more solid feel, perhaps, is a way to think about it. So think about this idea of hierarchy when you're looking at different kinds of maps. I would recommend picking up an atlas every once in a while if you can find one, or getting an electronic atlas of some kind and looking through it and seeing what has gone into the production of various kinds of maps in those atlases, and see if you can pick out this visual hierarchy, um, and see if it really works, um, or if you've never noticed it before, explore it a little bit. Oh, so here, this slide, this is in a live lecture. This would be an interactive portion where we would be going back and forth. What was the map about? What did you see first? How your eye tracks on it, and those are things that I would tend to point out live, and I just did on the previous slide. So um, the takeaway from this one would be, look at a variety of different types of maps wherever you can find them. See if you can tease out what the map maker intended when they created the map. Did they achieve a good visual hierarchy? Does it work in accordance with the theme or the objective of the map? So, how do we go about establishing visual hierarchy? We use everything else. Okay, everything else we're going to talk about in this section anyway. All of these concepts are going to be followed up with their own individual slides, but there's a lot of things that we can use together that work together in a synergy to create that visual hierarchy. So these terms that you can see here we'll explore in more detail over the next few minutes. But just that idea, this should strike home how important that idea of visual hierarchy is. All of these are components that we can use to establish that hierarchy of what's important, what's not as important, what's really, beside the point, but kind of nice to have in there. So the visual center is established out of sensation and perception and psychology, is that we have a being slightly above the geometric center of a piece of paper or any other flat object. So we perceive the center to be slightly higher than the geometric center. If we were to draw these lines across a sheet, bisecting it in half both ways, up, down, and side to side. So if we can design the map so it hangs a little bit above that, if it's centered a little bit above that, then the viewer is going to sense that map as being centered, even though it's really not. We just have humans have this innate cross-cultural feeling that being slightly above the geometric center looks better. So this is just something that looks better. Okay, it's not critical perhaps for map design, but it's just one of those little things. If you do it, it's gonna look a little bit better. From photography, and perhaps even from the field of artwork and painting, the rule of thirds is a compositional rule that we use for making photographs more interesting and making our subjects more interesting. And so on the left-hand side, we see this graph showing locations of our points for composition. The circles around the intersections are where you should center the main thing that you want, or something that you want to emphasize in the photo or the composition, whatever it is, and then work out the rest of it from there. So here, the top photo, we're trying to show this group of folks walking through kind of a Badlands area, and it's probably a group of tourists or a weekend class, and they're going out and getting lectured to by someone and looking at the landscape. And this is what people will typically do, is they'll put your object of the photo right dead center, and it shows a lot of information about the background on all sides, but it's really not as interesting as the one below. If we take advantage of that location on the rule of thirds diagram and say, well, I'm gonna put my group of people over here, and then it opens up the rest of the photo to really emphasize the background. And so we're getting a dual emphasis here of our people that we want to see and the background that we want to see, and we're kind of maximizing both by taking advantage of that point rather than putting the people dead center. So if you think about applying that to maps, if we throw our map off just a little bit in one direction or the other, it's going to open up space that we can use for other things um, on the printed map. Okay, so if we and this will be something that becomes clearer to you as you do a number of different map compositions throughout the semester. But just be aware, you don't have to always put the map dead center in the middle of the piece of paper. You know, you have a choice when you're making these things. You can modify it a little bit. And if you can modify it in such a way that it makes it interesting and gives you room to do other things on the map so the map tells a better story, that's great. Here, basic geometric alignment is important. Um, if you can visualize your map ahead of time as a series of columns or polygons within which you put information, either the map itself or the legend, text information, photos, written paragraphs, whatever it happens to be, that tends to work a little bit better for the overall composition of the actual printed map. And it works very well if you take the time to make sure that your edges are aligned properly and they're spaced a little bit apart and evenly between these different objects. So here's an example showing a map that gets used a couple of times in this lecture, looking at the continental United States, and 3 different rectangles containing information about the theme of the map: median rent by county in the lower 48. So the main map body is the largest rectangle and contains, perhaps the most information visually, and the 2 smaller rectangles contain the legend and then author information. And the author information box could have a little bit more stuff in it, perhaps, but that's all right. But what we can see there is that intersection between those. The map maker has done a good job of making sure that there are consistent distances between those, and the points are coming together in a way that geometrically makes sense. They're parallel to each other as much as possible, and so it's a nice, crisp, clean collection of different boxes containing information. They're all aligned well, so they're not distracting, is probably the main point to take away from this. If you throw in a bunch of boxes and they're all different sizes and nothing lines up very well, that makes it just look sloppy. And it looks like you didn't really put any effort into making the map, no matter how much time it took to do the analysis. If the geometry that we see here around these pieces of the map is not looking good, then people are not going to feel very good about your work. This slide focuses in on a concept that's quite often overlooked by people that aren't trained in cartography at all, and that's the use of negative space. We can also think of this as map balance. And what we would like to see as cartographers is a good, efficient use of space. We don't like wasted space. Wasted space, it isn't a very efficient use of your printed material. Okay, so this goes back to the printed map primarily, but the concept plays forward into electronic maps quite nicely too. So some of the things we want to be aware of here on the bullet points: we don't want to crowd the elements of the map together. We don't want to leave large empty spaces. We want to use space as a design element itself, and that, as the last bullet point indicates, it's a very subtle way of doing things, but if we group things intelligently and we make good use of space on the map, we wind up with a better product. So we can see two examples here of the same thing. Again, the same uh, uh, theme that's being used on multiple slides in this section. Median rent by county. On the top, we see a classic portrait style map with portrait orientation of the paper, and the paper is our dark line around everything, representing the edge. And everything in it. Then there's our map, median rent by county, showing the continental U.S. and some other pieces. The legend, the north arrow, a scale bar, and then author information in a box. And then in the upper left-hand corner, there's that little squiggle of stuff up in there, and that represents southeast Alaska. So, and it's cutting off the main part of Alaska. So this is a data set that shows the United States. Well, what's also missing? Hawaii, not on there. Okay, and maybe the theme of our map is median rent by county in the lower 48. We want to avoid the other two states because they just don't work well on a map. We'd have to do something else, do some other tricks to make them show up properly. But look at the rest of that composition. There's a lot of white, a lot of area that's just not being used well. So if you think about the costs of printing maps, if I'm a publisher, this is something I'm wasting a page on this. I'm using ink and all that, but I'm just, it just doesn't work well. And speaking as kind of a biased person trained in cartography, this is a horrible map. It just doesn't work. Okay, this is what we'd expect people to do, not if they're at the college level. All right. So we start thinking about how we can balance the map out. Well, the first thing we can do is say, well, hey, let's switch from that portrait orientation maybe to a landscape orientation, because the object of our map is the continental United States. It is oriented more east-west than north-south. So let's just switch the paper that way and switch how it's drawn in ArcGIS from the portrait style to the landscape style. And all of a sudden, it fits better. Okay, and we're going to draw a neat line around the feature of the continental United States. That's the little box that's separating it from everything else. We'll move the title down within that box. Orient the north arrow and the scale bar down off the coast of California to the south where Mexico would be. Let's throw it there. That's kind of a nice, convenient place to put things. Take the legend box, throw it in the upper left-hand corner, put the author information, and maybe I'd put a little bit more information in there or something. But in essence, by creating those other two neat lines around those objects and placing them there in this landscape orientation, we've now got a much better, efficient use of space, although there's still a lot of white around it. Quite honestly, I don't like that, but this is the choice that Price made when she made the maps. It's a much better use of space. It looks cleaner. It's easy to understand. There's no elements that are just hanging out there nonsensically that we can't necessarily make sense out of. Okay, that is a much better map. So we're achieving a balance between the different elements of the map, and a map element is any of these features that we see: the title, the legend, author information, or publication information. The object of the whole thing is the map itself. Where is that on the printed form? Where are the other things? The north arrow, if we need one. We could probably do away with the north arrow here. We don't really need it. The scale, it does still work, although it is distorted. We're now focused in on an individual country, and that's a little bit more appropriate to use a scale bar for that. So that makes sense. But overall, we've achieved a balance between all of the different things we're trying to depict, and then the white space that just doesn't receive anything else. Okay. So hopefully that makes some sense. We're making use of the space on the map by maximizing the size of the different elements in relation to each other to emphasize the map and then the other pieces of it to occupy as much of, think of it as a painting, the canvas. We're trying to occupy as much of the canvas as possible in a logical way that's easy to read and gets the point across. And doing very small little nudges here and there, little things, achieves a much better map product.